Welcome to my presentation, Noise Restriction and the Live Music Sector. This is a case study I'm working on about the musical soundscape of San Antonio. I want to take a moment to thank MEIEA for supporting my work with a generous faculty research grant. Thank you, MEIEA. The purpose and benefits of my research is to study the effect of noise levels experienced by patrons at entertainment venues across San Antonio, but also to understand what is being done to protect those venues and the patrons. I anticipate to be able to perhaps create a toolkit or some sort of set of policy suggestions to help preserve music entertainment venues and its relations with residential areas and the whole process of gentrification that is pushing those venues out of those areas. At stake of this particular work are, of course, the perception of noise itself, the idea that each city is unique, but also venues are unique, and within those venues, each space is unique, and so I'm paying particular attention to that. And of course, I'm looking at the nature of the public space and the idea of noise ordinances and so forth. I really want to understand again what is done to protect, but also inform music consumers, and perhaps even from the perspective of disclosure laws and ticket selling and the retail industry. The inspiration for this work comes from partly the fact that I'm a member of the San Antonio Music Commission for the Department of Arts and Culture in San Antonio. And as such, we worked on a strategic plan that came up with a few objectives. And among those objectives was to research best practices and policies in place to protect live venues near residential growth. As an overview of my methodology, it's very much an interdisciplinary type work, and it's also very exploratory in nature. So I had to survey different literatures and involving sound regulations, some urban studies, some sound studies, some consumer disclosure laws articles, and of course articles that treat noise-induced hearing loss. As of now, I have captured and analyzed 31 decibel readings across various venues in San Antonio. That work has been interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and I expect to resume that as soon as it is possible, and hopefully increase my sample to about 70 readings. I'm interested in developing a few GIS maps, some geometric information system maps, which are interactive web maps. And, right now I have one that is showing the variations in average dBAs from the readings I collected across San Antonio. And also it uses an additional variable by musical genres. So that is a useful tool. I also intend to conduct structured interviews with venue owners, operators, and potentially an abatement officer for the city of San Antonio. I have secured the IRB for this process, but again, the COVID-19 pandemic has interrupted this type of work. However, I will have several of those interviews completed by the time of the conference, and will be able to address those during the Q&A portion of this presentation. Finally, I was able to work on a noise experiment in a controlled environment, and that's perhaps like one of the most interesting aspects of my research so far. Some general literature insight. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Noise is defined as unwanted sound, and that's certainly the position I'm taking. Similar studies to that I could find that did something remotely similar to what I do is a few studies about New Orleans. They're mostly discussions about zoning and noise debates between the public and private entities in town, but also mostly discuss the lack of resolutions of these debates. The city of New Orleans did a study of nosebleeds, so decibel readings outside of venues, but did not do so inside. And not much came out of that study. It was very general, and it didn't yield a whole lot of results. Another research article that I found interesting and that I'm highlighting here is an article by Gibson and Holman and the impact of growing urban gentrification and associated cost of living and increased commercial rents that go with it, as well as additional policies that make it really difficult for venues to thrive, as well as musicians. And this particular study was done in Sydney, Australia, but it can explain similar patterns happening in cities such as Austin, Texas. Finally, I looked at an interesting study that is fairly recent from Norway, and this one is about sound regulations and the different listening levels of pop concerts in Norway, and how and basically treats a sample of these festivals, I think about 4 of those, and identifying the ones that took the recommendation from the World Health Organizations to limit their listening levels. And those who did so were able to stabilize the sound around 100 dBA, which is still loud, but I thought that was an interesting literature article. Anyway, in terms of disclosure laws, there are quite a lot of... First, there are no disclosure laws truly present in the entertainment space related to noise. Even federal agencies disagree. So, for instance, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, allows for about 2 hours of exposure at 100 dBA sound level without any hearing exposure per day, and they find that it's acceptable, which obviously we know that it is not. Whereas the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health recommend that at 100 dBA, that you spend less than 15 minutes at that sound level, experiencing that sound level per day. So I found that interesting. In terms of San Antonio's noise ordinance, there is only a very short paragraph addressing entertainment zones. And it really is mostly about monitoring sound levels outside the venues at the extreme end of the property, and in order to be acceptable, it cannot exceed 85 decibels, and the way this is measured is across a 2-hour span, and they take the average of a 2-hour span of measurement, as far from the property still on site as possible, and see how that computes. So that's pretty much the only disclosure that there is over there. In terms of data collection, I went to 31 venues, as I mentioned, and I collected the date when I did my visits, the location, the venue type, was it a theater, a bar, or a stadium, the capacity, what's the sitting or standing capacity, was there noise bleed outside the venue, was it an indoor or outdoor venue, what musical genre was performed and what group performed, was the show amplified, and then I showed the minimum dBA, maximum dBA, the average dBA captured during my sample. The next slide describes the descriptive statistics of the decibel readings that I have. It shows that the median venue capacity was about 480, and that out of my 31 visits, 24 of those experienced sound bleed, 26 were indoor venues, 22 used amplification, and the average decibel reading was about 86.3 dBA, with a peak decibel reading of 112.9. So that's as loud as I was able to document that. And the following slide shows those particular readings, and so you can see where the averages sits, and those are the little triangles across every single sample I took. This slide is followed by a slide that shows the venue capacities of the particular venues that I visited. Most of them are in between the range of 100 and 400 capacity, so mostly standing capacity. They tend to be bars. The ones that are a little bit larger tend to be outdoor venues. I created then a correlation matrix based on the data that I collected. Among some of the interesting, strong positive correlation, the use of amplification. The more amplification you use, the more noise bleed you generate. So we see a 0.84, correlation there. A correlation of 1 will be 100%, will be like absolute. So this is very strong. We also see that the higher the average dBA, the more noise bleed is experienced at these venues. So that's the 0.52 highlighted value. Interesting value here is the negative value that we see in between the venue capacity and noise bleed, which indicates that the larger the venue, the less noise bleed you have, which implies that smaller venues tend to experience more noise bleed, which makes sense. So if you have a bar with, say, a capacity of 75, it is most likely that if you have an amplified show in there, that is going to be heard outside of the venue. The following slide shows work that is based on an article that I published in a MEIEA journal 2 years ago. And this is a heat map representation of the concentration of concert venues in town. So when I say concert venues, they can be bars, they can be restaurants, and so forth. So they're mostly venues that feature music on a regular basis. And we have about over 300 of those, but most of them are concentrated in the downtown region. That's why we see this yellow hue there. Here's a different GIS map that shows some of the samples that I already collected. And we can see that rock and indie rock tend to have a higher average dBA than, say, classical music. And then that gray circle to the left is a heavy metal show. So those are usually in a range of in between 90 and 100 dBA. Finally, I created a noise experiment in a hall that has 494 seats. I wanted to identify how unique each space within that space is. And so I used a single sound source in a mono format that was, played, using a Behringer single speaker on stage as a sound source. And that particular sine wave is available in the next slide, and you're welcome to listen to it. It's not particularly pleasant to listen to. It's meant to be noise, but it's also meant to be a very flat response, so that it's easy to measure, easier maybe to measure. And that particular sine wave includes 3 pitches. One at 500 hertz, one at 1000 hertz, one at 2000 hertz. And we played them at respectively 70 dBA, 90 dBA, and 100 dBA. And the way we did this is I placed a decibel meter about a foot or so from the speaker and measured those outputs, and then saw what kind of attenuation, what kind of absorption was happening throughout the hall. So we collected about 4,446 samples of decibel readings. I had a team of students help me with this, and we used the Decibel X app, which is available on both iPhones and Androids, and I have a link at the bottom of the slides if you're interested in learning more about this particular app. It is practical. It gives some, you have access to some outputs, either in Excel or in PDF format, which is nice. But then what I did is I used those readings and calculated the sound pressure, intensity measure, and loudness levels for each of those readings. So we multiplied this sample by 4. And I also took about 497 360-degree photos, one from each seat plus one from the stage, the aisles, and so forth, and created a web app with hotspots that feature visualization of each seat as well as of the stage, and associated graphs from these calculations indicating the sound attenuation or absorption levels that say a potential consumer that will buy, or customer that will buy a ticket in that particular space will be able to experience. And so the next slide shows the type of speaker that we used, and it has also that sine wave sample that you're welcome to listen to. Next are a couple of examples of the graphs that I mentioned earlier for different seats across the hall. And you can see how absolutely unique each seat truly is, from even just different levels of frequency and decibel projection, but also the intensity, loudness, and sound pressure levels are very, very different, or at least the perception of those three is different and unique. The following slide shows my rationale on how I calculated those. And next, you can see a sample of the 3D Vista Hotspot app that I use to visualize, say, that particular seat, one in row A, with the associated graphs that indicate the properties, the sound properties of that particular seat. You can see also a couple of hotspots there on that particular picture. You see a camera. If you once I'll be able to like show how this app works live in the Q&A session of my presentation. But you click on that, it'll show you, it'll expand into a video and shows a particular show that happened in this hall so that you can visualize what the show looks like. It adds an additional feature for a potential patron. And then you also have the ability to like get on the stage and see and have a viewpoint of the hall from the stage itself. The following slide shows a row T, seat 6, and you see the floor plan that pops up at the same time and indicates where you are in the hall. On the right hand side, you see the property of that particular seat acoustically, and you see also a couple of hotspots throughout the hall. The one all the way to the front on the right is the picture that I showed earlier, which is certainly seat 1 in row A, and then I show an example of another hotspot in the middle of the hall, which is probably row K. Next, you see a radar chart sound map of that particular space. This is, as I mentioned, this is for me an exploratory type project. I'm trying things here, and I have so much data, and I'm trying to like see how best to visualize this data in both non-aggregated and aggregated form. And so as I was looking at different chart types and ways of visualizing this, I came across this radar chart format, and it's very useful. I find it's actually very revealing. We see here that in this particular hall, there is a major sound attenuation in rows K and J, which indicates that, a lot of the time we assume that the best sound happens in the middle of the hall. Whereas here, it certainly is not the case. So my initial findings show that there is a lack of disclosure laws, that each space is very unique, that there is, different forms of correlations happening, between noise bleed and amplification, and negative correlation in between the size of the venue and noise bleed. I find that, I believe that this work will indicate and give some implication on, not only sound studies, but also consumer choice and the scale, for instance, the scaling of a house at specific venues. Since every seat is unique, I believe every seat should have a different price, and not just based on the ability to see from a certain vantage point, which is often how these the scaling is done. So what to expect at the MEIEA Summit? It's ongoing research. I'll be able to show you how that 3D hotspot app works. I'll have some structured interviews for you to look at and share, the insight I got from those. So there's quite a bit to look forward to, and I hope that you'll join me to learn more about my work and ask me some questions and give me some very much needed feedback. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Take care.